Michigan, Wisconsin, sometimes on the U.S. side of the border.
This will be a historic first.
Starting on time.
Better turn the machine out here.
Buju, Pabdang Meshe Kyak Kyak Dijnakaz, Abawating Don Jaba, Ajijak Dodam, and Shnabe Ojibwe and Ao. Good evening. My name is Marty Reinhardt. I work here for the Center for Native American Studies as an assistant professor of Native American Studies. I teach about education and tribal law and government and just general Native American issues, and whether they're in Michigan, Wisconsin, sometimes on the U.S. side of the border, sometimes on the Canadian side of the border. And the presentation this evening is going to be about all of that and probably much more. Before we do get started, I'd like to remind people, please turn down your cell phones so we don't have these crazy interruptions based on your cell phone going off. And I do have a few announcements about some things that we're doing through the Center for Native American Studies, including our Native American Service Learning Partnership Institute this Thursday and Friday. If you are so inclined, we do have some great speakers lined up, including Bill Mendoza, who is the White House Initiative on American Indian Alaska Native Education Executive Director. He'll be our keynote on Thursday evening on April 3rd. On April 4th, we have another keynoter who will be McClellan Hall, who is the director of the National Indian Youth Leadership Project. And we have a lot of local session presenters, including students from our Native American Service Learning Project and other classes here on campus. So it's a great time to learn about service learning, to hear some great speakers. And following that, we have the new White House initiative called My Brother's Keeper. Bill Mendoza will be doing a roundtable with American Indian males lower than the age of 25 and younger. So if any of you are American Indian males, 25 and younger, we will have a session after the Institute on Friday, and that's between 4:30 and 5:30 p.m., also in the Great Lakes rooms over in the UC. Beyond that, we do want to remind folks that we have a number of fall semester courses lined up in Native American Studies. We have flyers that are actually being passed around or can be passed around. And one of the courses I'll be teaching this fall is Warrior Games. If anyone has ever played, what is that game? Capture the Flag. Raise your hand if you've played Capture the Flag before when you were a kid or something. Well, this is like Capture the Flag on steroids, Anishinaabe style times 10. So if that appeals to you, come join my course and we'll have a lot of fun this fall. It's the first 4 Fridays, or I guess it's the 4 Fridays of September. We'll be playing right out here on the Fit Strip near NMU. So, our guest this evening, Dr. Phil Bellfy, is a friend of mine. I've known Phil for almost 25 years now. When I was an undergrad student is when I first met Phil. I'd just gotten back from the United States Army, and Phil was well into his career by then. One of my mentors and friends in Native American Studies, and I've often looked at Phil's work and in some ways mirrored my own after it. And the reflections, I can see my work reflected in his work on treaties, land ethics, activism. And, you know, Phil is a retired professor emeritus out of Michigan State University, one of the founders or co-founders of the American Indian Studies program at Michigan State. I went to Michigan State for a year and then I switched and went elsewhere. But my years at Michigan State have certainly influenced my perspectives, and I was glad for the experience in meeting Phil and others from that area, and then been working with Phil on different projects afterwards throughout my career, and I'm glad to see that Phil is now retired and certainly not inactive. He's very active on American Indian environmental issues and issues that are of great concern to our sovereignty as First Nations. Phil is going to be presenting on a book this evening called Three Fires Unity, the Anishinaabe of the Lake Huron Borderlands. And I take this near and dear to my heart because my family is Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, and Phil and I have exchanged many stories about my childhood growing up in the Sugar Islands, Sault Ste. Marie area, and the things that I find very important to this border community. So without going on and on and on about my life and experiences, I'd like you to help me welcome Dr. Phil Bellfy.
Holy smokes, I didn't know that I was such an important person. Well, as Marty said, that I am retired from Michigan State University, so I'm very happy to say that I'm a recovering academic. I've been sane now for about 18 months. I'm very happy. I'm a pretty long ways along my 12-step program. And people ask me, well, what do you do now that you're retired, Phil? And essentially, I do what I did when I was teaching at Michigan State. Of course, they gave me the paychecks now I'm getting mine from Social Security. So that's quite a big difference. But I'm a community activist is what I do. I have obviously a lot of spare time on my hands now. So I'm still very active, as Marty says, and not only in Native issues and environmental issues, which is a huge part of what I do, but I'm also involved in the politics of things. And as the title says there, that Sugar Island and Nebish Island are unceded territory. And what I'm going to talk about tonight is an extension of the very end of that book that Marty mentioned. And I do talk about some of these issues in the book, but I'll go into a lot of more detail on it. And in order to discuss that contemporary history, we have to go back a long, long ways. Sorry to say. Whoop, geez, that's awful loud. Just to get my glasses on. Everybody awake now? I'm going to have to read some of this stuff because, and I love to say this. Whoop, it didn't go down. Oh, there we go. I love to talk about papal bulls. There's just something about that term that kind of strikes a reasonable chord. But there were 3 papal bulls that were issued. As you can see the dates back there. The first 2 were before discovery. The third one was after discovery, obviously. And the first one is that 1452, and I'm going to read a section of it. I don't know if it's on the screen or not. Yes. Oh, no, that's a different one. Sorry. We grant you, that is the kings of Spain and Portugal, and of course the Pope is saying we, it's that royal we, I guess. We grant you by these present documents, with our apostolic authority, full and free permission to invade, search out, capture, and subjugate the Saracens and pagans and any other unbelievers and enemies of Christ wherever they may be, as well as their kingdoms, duchies, counties, principalities, and other property, and to reduce their persons into perpetual slavery. That's what the Pope is saying in 1452. And of course, the slave trade was going at that period of time. Obviously, it was not Native people who were being enslaved, but African people from Africa were being enslaved at that time. So that papal bull is what's usually looked at as when you reference the doctrine of discovery, that you have the right, that is European nations, the kings of Spain and Portugal, to go and subjugate people and steal their land from them. All right, so the other 2, the 1455 one is kind of an extension of that, and I don't have the reading of it here. But that last one, the 1493, obviously it was after Columbus got lost and found himself here in the so-called New World. There was a problem, because who gets to subjugate the people of this hemisphere? So what the Pope did is he essentially drew a line down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and said, okay, everything on the east side belongs to Portugal, and everything on the west side of that line, Spain can go and invade those people and subjugate them into perpetual slavery, etc. So what all of this really means is not a doctrine of discovery. It is a doctrine whereby the European powers are agreeing that only one European power gets to screw around with these so-called pagans. The Saracens were the Muslim people. And that's all it did. It didn't say, you have that land by right of discovery. It says, you have that land if you can wrest it from them, if you can steal it from them, if you can kill all of them, then you can subjugate them. So the modern interpretations of that doctrine of discovery are completely distorted, and it's obvious for the reason why. Because if they actually agreed to accept what it really says, then I'm sorry to say, all of you non-native people got to go back to wherever you came from. Because the doctrine of discovery does not give you this land. You have to treat with the native people. And I'll get to this next thing here. In 1671, they had this thing they called a pageant of Saint Lussan, and I don't know how to pronounce it in the French way. But Saint Lussan was the emissary of the Sun King, Louis XIV, and he came over here. And I want to read this part to you, too, because of the echoes that you can hear a couple centuries before. Saint Lussan declared, in the name of the most high and redoubtable sovereign, Louis XIV, Christian king, that's a very important point, Christian king of France and Navarre, I now take possession of all these lakes, straits, rivers, islands, and regions lying adjacent thereto, and I declare all the people inhabiting this wide country that they now become my vassals, and that other princes and potentates of whatever rank they are denied forever seizing upon or settling within these circumjacent seas. So here we have the French come to Sault Ste. Marie, Bawating, and just by way of a personal note, my 10th father was the representative of all the Ojibwe people, Kitchinizea. He was the person who represented all of the Ojibwe people. There were 14 tribes, I think, that were represented at this pageant. It's called a pageant by those people. We would call it a council. And this was an agreement that we, the native people of this entire region, that came all the way from Green Bay and everywhere else, we agree that we are going to be, in a sense, forming an alliance with the French people. They are our friends, our brothers, our sisters, our relatives, and we accept them into our territory. The French, of course, are saying to everybody else who's out there looking for land to take over and kill the native people, don't mess with these people here. We are protecting them. We have made an alliance with them. So the language is almost identical to what was discussed by the Pope hundreds of years before. All you other people, all you other Europeans, stay away. Only one group of people gets to deal with the natives at a time. And we are those people right now. So then we move on. The French are defeated by the British in 1760, I think it was, and the British take over. And so the British have this proclamation, and let's see if I got some language out of that. Papers are sticking together here. Okay, it says here, and whereas it is just and reasonable and essential to our interests, that is the British, and the security of our colonies, the United States, which weren't that called that at the time, that several nations or tribes of Indians with whom we are connected and who live under our protection should not be molested or disturbed in the possession of such parts of our dominion and territories as, not having been ceded to or purchased by us, are reserved to them or any of them as their hunting grounds. In other words, the Pope made the claim that only one European nation, in this case it would have been Spanish, of course, Spain, were east of the line they drew down the middle of the ocean. The French came in later and said, okay, now we are the people that get to treat with the native folk, Now the British are saying, nope, I'm sorry, the French are no longer here. We are the people who get to treat with the native people. We will not disturb them in their hunting grounds. They recognized our sovereignty. Okay, so we all know what happens next, right? The British are defeated by the Americans. And so the Americans, let's see, they're not doing it. What's going on here? It won't even shift itself down here. And we might get another slide here, but I don't know. It's locked up. Isn't technology wonderful? I used to teach a class. I taught it many, many times. It was a writing class, and the theme was science and technology. And one of the books I had my students read was In the Absence of the Sacred. Anybody ever hear of that book by Jerry Mander? The Failure of Technology and the Survival of the Indian Nations. That's what it was. So when these kinds of things happen, well, I guess the failure of technology, but we're still here. Oh, it's got a little thing saying, oh, I'm thinking about something, guys. Well, we may have to do this without the benefit of technology if it won't advance my slides here, which would be unfortunate. Well, anyway, the U.S. government obviously took over from the British, and I think it was, let's see here, 1783. The federal government, the federal U.S. government issued its own proclamation. And the language of that proclamation was almost identical to the British. In other words, they're saying to everybody, the French were here, they got pushed out by the British. The British made the claim over Indian territory. We pushed the British out, so now we're making the claim. This is our jurisdiction now. Nobody else can mess with them. We are the only group of people that have the right to treat with the native people. And if we do not buy or they do not cede their territory, it is theirs. We are not going to steal it from them. Nobody gets to steal it from them. And this is the big difference in the big split, if you will, between the early papal stuff, where it said, let's just go out and kill everybody and steal all their stuff. They discovered that that's really, really expensive. It's horribly expensive, not only in lives, but also in, quote, treasure, as they say these days. So it's much easier to go in there and try to be nice to them, you know? Come over here with $24 worth of beads and buy Manhattan. It's a lot easier. Nobody gets killed. Everything's wonderful and great. So when we talk about the doctrine of discovery, it is really the doctrine of who gets to treat with the native people. That's why they call them treaties. Who gets to sit down and negotiate the terms of this land cession or this peace or whatever it is. That's what it all is about. Okay, so in my notes here it says, we have one more document, and that's the Northwest Ordinance. When I was growing up as a young person, I thought the Northwest Ordinance, well, you know, that's Oregon and Washington. But when they said the Northwest Ordinance in 1787, they meant this part of the world right here. That was the Northwest at the time. So the language here, and I'll quote it again, the utmost good faith shall always be observed toward the Indians. Their land and property shall never be taken without their consent, and in their property rights and liberty they shall never be invaded or disturbed. Okay? That's what the Northwest Ordinance said. We cannot steal this land from them. They have to either sell it to us or cede it to us, and it all has to be done very peacefully. They shall never be invaded nor disturbed. Okay, so in all of these, there is that argument that only one sovereign, that is, in the European sense, gets to treat with the native people. So then we have the Treaty of Paris, talks about how the U.S. and Great Britain, after the war, they agreed that they're not going to mess with the native people. They're going to divide that territory. They're going to say, okay, this is British on this side of the line, this is American on the other side of the line. But they have to draw that boundary. They have to figure out a way to draw that boundary. And remember, there's really no land masses that they have to deal with because they haven't gone west of Lake Superior yet. So it's all about, we follow this water course. We follow this water and we go down this river, and there's always disputes over which river they're talking about because their geography wasn't very good in those days. But that was the whole idea, the water communication. And when they first drew up that treaty language, what they would do is they would say, well, we'll just go down the middle of the river. And what if we come to an island? Well, we'll just go down the middle of the island. And then we'll just pick it up on the other side and just go down the middle of the river. Well, they found that that's probably not a very good idea because they got ships out there in the water, and the ships are going from A to B, and are they in U.S. territory? Are they in British territory? They don't want to invade each other's sovereignty. So they decided what they would do is they would change that to follow the shipping channels. Okay? So what happens when you come to an island? Well, you got to figure out which side's going to get the island. Who's going to get this island? Who's going to get that island? They decided that we don't want to go down the middle anymore because it doesn't work very well. So that's what the Treaty of Paris did. It set out this process whereby they would determine who was and who was not going to be allowed. This is how I put it. They don't put it that way. But who gets to treat with the native people in this area? Who gets to treat with them, depending on which side of the border they're on? We've got this thing all working out again. All right. Federal Proclamation, 1783. The Northwest Ordinance, the line that I read to you, Treaty of Paris. Along the middle of said water communication into Lake Huron, thence through the middle of said lake to the water communication between that lake and Lake Superior. Today we call that the St. Mary's River. That water communication between Lake Huron and Lake Superior. Okay, that's what it looks like. This is the water communication. This is Lake Huron, and way up in the other corner up there, that's Lake Superior. So how do you negotiate your way, as your boundary surveyors, how do you negotiate your way through all that? What do? Oh, there's one other thing I should talk about first. Has anybody ever heard of the Jay Treaty? Few people. That was 1794. Obviously, the Revolution was over, the Treaty of Paris was over, and how many of you know the official title of the Jay Treaty? John Jay was the chief of the Supreme Court at the time. He went to London to negotiate that treaty. That's why they usually call it Jay's Treaty or the Jay Treaty. But its official title is the Treaty of Amity, Commerce, and Navigation. Amity being a nice word for let's be friends. Because there was all this border problem. And they didn't know what's going on. Are we in American waters or in British waters? That's the communication part of it. And the commerce, well, what if the native people are bringing furs from A to B? Are they crossing the border, or what are they doing here? Who's got the jurisdiction? So they tried to resolve those issues by the Jay Treaty. And in that treaty, there is a very, very important statement. I don't know if, I guess I didn't put it up on there. But it's a little bit long, and I'm going to read it to you. This is Article 3 of the Jay Treaty. It is agreed that it shall at all times be free to His Majesty's subjects and to the citizens of the United States, and also to the Indians dwelling on either side of the said boundary, freely to pass and repass by land or inland navigation into the respective territories and countries of the two parties on the continent of America, and then it's a parentheses, which is in the document, the country within the limits of the Hudson Bay Company only excepted. And then it says, no duty of entry shall ever be levied by either party on peltries bought by land or inland navigation into the said territories respectively, nor shall the Indians passing or repassing with their own proper goods and effects of whatever nature pay the same and pay for the same any impost or duty whatever. And the significance of that thing, most people look at the significance and they say, well, we have treaty right to cross that border and not be charged for bringing import or whatever, etc. But the thing that's important to me, and what I've been trying to tell people for a very long time, is that's important, of course, but what is more important in that statement? Anybody have an idea what might be more important? It's an acknowledgement of the nationhood that the Native people enjoy. They say, and I'm quoting again, His Majesty's subjects to the citizens of the United States and to the Indians dwelling on either side of said boundary. They're not British citizens. They're not American citizens, or British subjects, as they call them. They are the Anishinaabe. They have that right to sovereignty, especially in the context of the land was not ceded yet. It doesn't belong to the Americans or the British. It's their hunting grounds, and they will never be invaded nor disturbed. So that's really, really very important, that particular clause, that article, for not only the free passage back and forth, but for the recognition of native sovereignty. And that's something they don't want to discuss either, because that would throw everything into a big, big problem. So the Treaty of Amity, Commerce and Navigation, 1794, what happens in 1812? We're just recognizing that 200 years later. Well, that amity goes right out the window, the War of 1812. And I don't know if I had put anything up on it. Oh, there's the Jay Treaty. Okay. The Treaty of Ghent ended the War of 1812. And according to Article 14, it says, the United States of America engaged to put an end immediately after the ratification of the present treaty to hostilities with all the tribes or nations of Indians with whom they may be at war at the time of such ratification, and forthwith to restore to such tribes or nations respectively all of the possessions, rights, and privileges which they may have enjoyed or been entitled to in 1811 previous to such hostilities. Again, it's another recognition. The Native people, they have their rights, their possessions, their land, their sovereignty is intact. It has not been abrogated, demolished, or diminished by the war. And they all agree to it. And later, of course, the Britannic Majesty agrees to the same terminology, that the Native people have all the rights and privileges that they had before. Nothing has changed because of the war between you and I, U.S., etc. So there's also a problem in the Treaty of Ghent. They still hadn't resolved this border problem. Where does the border lie? So they say, and whereas doubts have arisen what was the middle of said river, lakes, and water communications, and whether certain islands lying in the same were within the dominions of His Britannic Majesty or the United States, in order, therefore, finally, to decide these doubts, they shall be referred to 2 commissioners to be appointed, sworn, and authorized to act to resolve this issue. So this is 1814, the Treaty of Ghent. They still haven't figured that out. 1776, the Revolution. You still don't know where the border is. They've still got a bunch of problems. And one of the problems was the St. Mary's River. So I go back to that slide if I can. And where does the border, how do you navigate through all those islands there? Well, what happened was they were supposed to go down the shipping channel. That was part of the idea. So the shipping channel was over here. I'm sorry. This is Detour, Drummond Island. This is Drummond Island. The British had Drummond Island, had a fort there. It was more or less British territory. But instead of going down the shipping channel, the boat went around this way. And the British, this is the story, and it's hard to tie it down, but it was apparently during the summer, it was hot, and it was miserable, and the mosquitoes were biting that British commissioner all to pieces, and so he went below deck to escape the mosquitoes. He might have been drinking a little too much rum, too, it's hard to say. So the Americans who were navigating the ship said, oh, hell, he's not here. Let's go around the other side. So they just went around Drummond Island and stole it, literally stole it from the British. I guess they were madder than hell about that. It's a big chunk of property, huge area, and they lose it. So what happens, they're doing their survey, and this is 1828. They hadn't gotten around to figuring out lots of things. They're still doing their survey. And that other map, well, St. Joseph is the other big island out there. That becomes British territory. But something that I don't know the answer to this, but you see how close they come to the British side? They're drawing their line as close as they can to the border. And everybody, if I would have been there, I would have said, what do you mean? The boats go, they hug the shoreline? No, they should just, they go through. But anyway, whatever the case is, this is literally the document. I scanned it and I put it into this slide. The termination line is the word that they used to describe what the commissioners did in 1828. They come up, they're all mad about Drummond Island, at least the British are mad about it. They say, okay, we're going to give you St. Joseph, but we don't know what we're going to do with Sugar Island. They pretty much figure that Nebuchadnezzar Island is going to go to the Americans, but they don't know what they're going to do with Sugar Island. And so the commissioners say, let's just forget it. Let's just draw what we call the termination line. The border goes up there, and it stops. And we'll pick it up at the other end. So they pick it up at the other end. They say 1 mile from what they called it St. George Island at the time, from Sugar Island. 1 mile from Sugar Island, we will start our survey again. So there's another termination line here. This is 1828. They draw the border up through the rapids, and they go on up and they deal with the Rainy Lake area and that Lake of the Woods. It's very controversial, big problem. They had also resolved several issues between Maine and New Brunswick and in the Thousand Island area in New York, where the Akwesasne people are. They resolved those issues. Only thing that they did is they did not determine who has the right to treat with the native people over the disposition of Sugar Island and Nebuchadnezzar Island. Even though they said that Nebuchadnezzar will probably go to the Americans, they drew that line, the termination line, excluding Nebuchadnezzar and Sugar Island, and all the little islands that are in that area too, of course. Okay, so this is 1828. In 1836, the Americans want a land cession treaty. They come up, actually they don't come up to the same way, they hustle all the native people to Washington to sign a treaty. And they say, I wonder if I have the actual language or not here. Yes, in the treaty it says the land cession, the land ceded to the United States, thence northeast to the boundary line, Lake Huron, following the United States and the British, as established by the commissioners. Okay, we cede this land on the American side of the land, or the line that was established by the commissioners. That's what the treaty language says. Well, guess what? Nebuchadnezzar Island and Sugar Island are not part of that treaty because that line had not been determined. Nobody knew who was going to have the right to treat with the native people. They hadn't agreed to that. So that's 1836. Then we roll around to 1842. Remember, the American Revolution was 1776. 1842, they finally decide, okay, we're going to draw the line so that Sugar Island and Nevis Island are on the American side of the border. They don't have a cession of it, but they said, my interpretation of what they are saying is, okay, we've now decided that the Americans have the right to negotiate with the native people over the disposition of Sugar Island. This is 1842. So 1850 rolls around. The Canadian government wants to get a land cession in that same area. 1842 said that only the Americans get to treat with the native people. So we can't treat with them. We're following those very, very old dictates. Only one group of people gets to treat with the native people. So they don't get a cession either for Sugar Island. So what does that mean? Sugar Island has never been ceded. Never. Never, never, never. It's never been a part of any land cession. I think we got another picture here. As following said, line of acting by the commissioners, etc. Okay, here's a shameless plug. The Native Center on campus has some of these maps. It's kind of a long story. I suppose we could talk about it a bit. There was a gentleman who lived in the Detroit area. His name was Charlie Myers, and he was a very wealthy man. He was an Odawa person, and I won't go into the whole story about it, but he would collect. He said, I collect cowboys and Indians. He had all kinds of original Remington sculptures and all kinds of stuff. And he dealt with paper, too, on occasion. And this was his map. It's the 1837 Schoolcraft map of the map of the acting superintendency of Michigan, drawn by Henry Rose Schoolcraft, who was the Indian commissioner at that time. Charlie had that map. He bought it from an Odawa estate, and it came as part of the estate. And for whatever reason, I don't know, he decided he was going to sell that map. And the Newberry Library in Chicago was very interested in purchasing it. So they had to have it appraised. And the appraiser, and this is Charlie telling the story, so you'd have to take this into consideration. The appraiser thought that he was being set up because no one ever had seen this map before. As far as anybody knew, this was extraordinarily unique, and it is very unique. So he called in the FBI and said, I got this map, but I deal with paper. That's why I was being asked to appraise it and deal with old maps, but I've never seen this before. What can you tell me about it? And they claimed that it was stolen from the National Archives. We're not exactly sure when, and we're not exactly sure that we ever really had it, but because it was Schoolcraft's map, it must belong to the federal government. So they went to court, and Charlie lost his map. The word is replevened, which is the title of a book that I'm putting together on this map. And replevened is one of those really funny old British words that says, you stole it from me, so I'm stealing it back. That's what it means. And he lost the map. But before it was taken back to the, quote unquote, back to the archives, he had a photograph made of it, and he made prints of it and distributed them to some of his friends and people. And one of them was given to the Bentley Library at the University of Michigan, and I received a copy of it as well. I had it scanned professionally, and I had the people who did the scanning clean it up considerably, and I spent many, many, many hours learning how to work with Photoshop, and I cleaned it up. So you can read every word that's on there. You can read every number that's on there. You couldn't in the original. It was a mess, quite frankly. It was a mess. But anyway, the thing that's important is, on the next slide, I think shows it better. There's Sugar Island. That yellow color means It's a reserve. And it does say in the 1836 treaty that Sugar Island and all its islets are reserved for the Indians. And my friends up north, when we talk about this, they said, that's not a cession, that is a claim by the federal government, because everybody knew in 1836 that it was not part of the United States. They knew that. It was this huge international controversy because no one could agree on who gets Sugar Island. Everybody knew that. And I don't know if anybody agrees with me necessarily, but you probably can't read all that. But what this is the census of all the Indians in Michigan. It was the map showing the reservations in Michigan, and this is the census of all of the Indians in Michigan. So like up here at the Tequamanon River, Drummond Island, Grand Island, probably you all recognize that from this area, the Chocolate River. How many Native people are living there? And how many are here? How many are there? And that's what the numbers are. Sugar Island is not on that. Sugar Island, the Native people, huge numbers of Native people, they're not on there. Why? Because Schoolcraft knew they're not Indians of Michigan. They're not Michigan Indians. We don't know what they are, but they're not Michigan Indians, so he didn't put them on the list. That's my interpretation of it. I don't know if that's true or not. Some people have suggested that, I don't know where it is on there, but there is a list for the Sioux bands, I think it's called, and they were included in that number. But to my way of thinking, it is an extremely important map because it shows Sugar Island as part of Michigan when everybody knew that it was not. And Sugar Island Native people are not listed in the census as residents of Sugar Island, even though they said there was a reservation there. Why aren't they listed? So, again, it's kind of an odd thing to my way of thinking anyway. Okay, what's the next thing we're going to do here? Okay, go back to that picture. You see Bay Mills is a huge reservation in those days. Okay, here's the problem. When they finally got around to drawing the line, the border, it's no longer, let's go down the middle of the river. You look at the older pictures, like the one I showed you, that drawing, they go down the middle of the river, and that's where the border goes. If it goes like this, if the river goes like this, the border goes like this. But what do they do here? It's this crazy surveying stuff. You go to point B and you say, okay, from X number of degrees in such a direction, and you go X number of feet, and then you get to that point, and then from that point you get, this much. So this is where the border is today. This is Garden River Reserve, which some people would say is Sioux, Ontario. What's this stuff? What's that? Lake levels are pretty low, as we all know. They're low up there in the St. Mary's River. And that land is on the U.S. side of the border. And the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians, in their constitution, they say, and Marty, you can correct me, I don't have the language proper, but members of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians, if they are Garden River people, they can be members of the Sioux tribe. And there's something I didn't put in there either, but there's an 1855 treaty. It's essentially, I guess they call it an allotment treaty. And the allotment treaty says, again, I don't have it quoted necessarily directly, but it says that nothing in this section where the allotment is discussed shall affect the rights of the Garden River Band. They don't say the Garden River Band of Canada, they just say the Garden River Band. It's a recognition in a federal U.S. treaty, the 1855 treaty, that the Garden River people have rights on this side of the border. It's a recognized right in the treaty. And everybody knew the Garden River was across the river. Everybody knows it. And they knew it in 1855. So what the people at Garden River did when this, quote, land emerged, they had it surveyed. And I don't know if they ever did it or not. And I've talked to the Register of Deeds in Chippewa County. And she says, if they come in with a valid survey of that land, I have to put it into my books. If it's a valid survey done by a registered surveyor, and it shows that land, it's in Chippewa County, I have to register it. And that's what the people at Garden River were going to do. And I don't know, I'm not in the hierarchy to understand what they've done or not. But that was their intent, to say, look, we are not Canadian Indians. We have land on both sides of the border. There is no border there for us. We don't recognize the fact that you think there is a border there. Okay, so then we come into a really serious problem, though. 9/11. Previous to 9/11, Native people and most other people, of course, but Native people especially up in this area, they would just go across the border. Maybe they'd show their tribal card or driver's license. It doesn't make any difference. You just cross the border. I crossed the border up there thousands of times, probably, since I moved up there until 2001. 2001 changed everything. Changed everything. Obviously, they tightened up the border. We have more law enforcement officials in Sault Ste. Marie than we probably have people. It's unbelievable. We got border guards everywhere. Everywhere. They claim jurisdiction 100 miles from the border. So you see them down in Gaylord. You see them everywhere. Obviously, 100 miles from the border includes the entire Upper Peninsula, pretty much. Because they don't consider the border, that line out in the middle of someplace. They consider the border as a shoreline right here, just north of the school. That's where the border starts for them people. So we got Customs and Immigration, we got Border Patrol, we got the Coast Guard, we got Sioux Tribe Police, we got the County Sheriff, we got the City Police, we got State Police, we got conservation officers from the Michigan, we got Sioux Tribe conservation officers. I mean, we have so many policemen up there that it boggles the mind. We got half the people watching the other half. But they really clamped down on the border, and part of the law that they passed, I don't know exactly what the name of it is, but you have to have a secure ID. It has to be a secure ID, a picture ID with a readable magnetic strip. A passport, of course, works very fine. But in Michigan, you can get an enhanced driver's license that would serve that purpose. So Native people were being hassled constantly trying to cross that border. And the statistics, if you take all the number of people that go across the border at Sault Ste. Marie, about 30% of those crossings are Native people, which is a recognition of the fact that those communities are divided by that line, but they're not divided in a cultural or spiritual or even a political sense. That's a line drawn between the two nations, but it doesn't affect us because there's British citizens, or Canadians as we call them, and there's American citizens, and there's Native people who are residing in that territory along that border. So there's still that third sovereign in there. So one of the problems, and probably nobody really understands it, but treaties are the supreme law of the land. That's what the Constitution says. So the Jade Treaty takes precedent. The 1836 Treaty takes precedent. The 1855 takes precedent. So our argument is you can pass any damn law you want. Who cares? Treaty rights trump everything. So, and it's not really much of a problem for the U.S. people. Like me, for example, I have a passport because I had to go to Britain. You need a passport. You can't use your tribal card over there. So it wasn't a problem. Plus, I'm not a member of those 4 tribes that are in that area. I'm from White Earth. And so I don't have, there is a provision in the law that says that if a tribal community on the border can show a cultural connection, then they can they can pass that border without being hassled by people, but they still need some sort of enhanced ID. And so the Canadian government was trying to get all of the quote-unquote Canadian Indians to carry this new card that they were developing to make sure that it met the U.S. government regulations and secure and stripeable and all that. But there's a big problem. It's issued by the Canadian government. It's got the Canadian flag up on it, up in the corner of it. And the Native people up there said, and many other Native people said, no, I'm not carrying your card. I'm not Canadian. I'm Anishinaabe, or I'm Mohawk, or Blackfoot, or whatever. We're not doing it. So, and again, I wasn't part of the negotiations, so I'm only getting this stuff from what people tell me, people who were there. They had a meeting with the Homeland Security people, and they said, we want access to that exemption that you give to tribes going back and forth. And they granted them that exemption, but it had an expiration date. I think it was June 1st, 2010, if I remember correctly. In fact, I had them hold up the printing of that book until I got this documentation in there because I knew it was coming down. So in 2010, they had another negotiating session, and the Native people said, no, we're not doing it. The Garden River and Batchewana people said, no, we're not Canadian Indians. We're not going to do that. So, and this is the part that I don't know necessarily, but if you know anything about Sault Ste. Marie, the bridge on the Canadian side comes down on what is really Batchewana territory. And everybody pretty much recognizes it is Batchewana territory. So Chief Sayers, Dean Sayers said to them, if we can't pass that border, nobody's passing that border. It's our territory, and if we can't cross that border, well, nobody can. It's our territory. So they agreed. Okay, well, let's see, how can we work this out? So here's what they did, and it's very significant. They sat down and they negotiated an agreement. Yes, the First Nations people are going to have to come up with this ID. They, that is Batchewana and Garden River, bought the machinery to create these cards that are secure, will meet all the requirements of Homeland Security, the U.S. people. And the agreement that they made says, and I think it's a pretty damn close quote, Garden River and Batchewana are indigenous nations of North America. That's what it says. And I have to be honest, and with some sense of pride, they listed every treaty that I listed in my dissertation, which turned into this book, as the reason why they are indigenous nations of North America. Because of this treaty, the 1855 treaty, the 1836 treaty, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They recognize that. And it is the first time in the history of the world that the United States government recognized indigenous nations of North America. They're not Canadian Indians, they're not American Indians, they are Anishinaabe. That's what my dissertation did. I went through, I don't know how many treaties, I know you counted all the ones, but there's approximately 1,600 names of Native people who are signed to treaties both in the U.S. and Great Britain / Canada. And I went through and I analyzed all 1,600 of those names with my very, very limited Ojibwe language skills, very limited. But they didn't have any spelling conventions or anything like that. But I found approximately 36 Native people who either signed both treaties, like the 1836 treaty and the 1850 treaty, both in that same area. Some people's names are on both of those treaties. Sometimes you would find a person who is, quote, a Canadian Indian signing an American treaty, and vice versa, so-called American Indian signing a British treaty, all that kind of stuff. And the argument is that those people who signed those treaties were not Canadians, they were not British, they were not American, they were Anishinaabe. And they signed the treaty on behalf of the nation that represents all of the people. It doesn't make any difference which side of the border you live on. In fact, there was a big controversy after the revolution. Both sides were giving presents to Native people. You would go to Sault Ste. Marie and you'd get some presents. They did it at Drummond for a while. You go to Drummond and get some presents. You go to Penetanguishene, you get some presents. You go to Fort Malden, which is now Windsor, you get some presents. And they were told, both the American people and the British people, you never ask these people where they live. It's none of your business. They show up, you give them presents. Because they were trying to solidify their alliances with the Native people. And the Native people aren't stupid. They go to Penetanguishene and they say, oh, yeah, I'm Odawa. They go to Fort Drummond or maybe up to the Sioux and they say, oh, yeah, I'm Ojibwe. And then they go down to Fort Malden, oh, I'm Potawatomi. And they would get presents from everybody. And, of course, many Native people, when the removal came about, they had to move back and forth. Some of them didn't want to go to Kansas, so they went to Canada, quote unquote. So we have Native connections throughout that entire area. So this is a little bit different map. This is Sugar Island. It's a rather large island. And when the surveyors were going through there, the treaty commissioners, there was all kinds of problems, like I say, all the way from New Brunswick all the way up to Lake of the Woods. And their statement was that the only thing of value in the entire area is Sugar Island. It's the only thing of value. And it was in Helen Tanner's book, The Atlas. And I know that Helen Tanner did a very good job, so I'm going to accept the fact that she is correct on this. But they sold, that is, the Native people sold 12 tons of jam in one shipping season from Sugar Island. Think of it. How many of those jars would it be? So yes, it was a very valuable place. And that's why they were fighting over it. If it's just some stupid little island, who cares? But it was the most valuable part of that whole process. Here's the Treaty of Detroit. This provision shall not be construed to exclude any Indian now belonging to the Garden River Band of Sault Ste. Marie. They don't say Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, or whatever. So the border's a fiction. There is reservations. It says USA, and that says Indian Trust there. Oops. The Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians has, I think, maybe only like 40 acres. The Bay Mills Indian community has that area there. It's about 640 acres, a square mile, but it's obviously broken up into little pieces. And then we go back to this other picture here. This is Garden River. That's the Garden River Reserve. It says right there, Garden River. So obviously, I'm not a golfer, but you could shoot a golf ball across the river there. It's very, very narrow. And Batchewana is right next door. That's right there. Essentially, Batchewana was dispossessed of its land, and so Garden River was nice enough to let them live on the western end of it. But those four tribes, Garden River, Batchewana, Sioux Tribe, and Bay Mills Indian Community, they all have claims to that island. We're all the same people there. So here's my crazy stuff. Crazy, crazy ideas. Discussed with people up there a little bit. Nothing official, but Sugar Island should become, we're liking it to like the District of Columbia, which is the seat of government. It really doesn't belong to Maryland or Virginia, or even the people of the city of Washington don't have voting rights, etc. It's the District of Columbia. We need to have Sugar Island as the District of Bawateng. This is unceded territory, doesn't belong to the U.S., doesn't belong to Canada. It belongs to the native people. And this is St. Joseph Island Bridge. I showed you that earlier map. You could build a bridge across from Garden River very easily. No problem at all. And why not? It's the same people. And the Sugar Island Ferry, that's the U.S. side of the ferry dock, that's where the border should be. If the border guards want to stand there at the ferry and check people for their IDs or whatever, well, there's not much we can do about it. But they shouldn't be up in the St. Mary's River because that's unceded. That's native territory. People should be free to just do whatever they want to do, go back and forth. Go back again to that survey. And Nebuchadnezzar Island is kind of funny because the surveyor's notes say that we both agree that Nebuchadnezzar Island will go to the Americans, but they drew that line before it was adjudicated. So I want to say, Miigwech, thank you very much for your kind attention. And I suppose we got time. Geez, I went for a whole hour? God, I can flap my jaw like crazy. Well, it's a very, very odd thing. And it's mainly because of the tariff, the duty-free stuff. Okay, the question was, why doesn't Canada recognize the Jay Treaty? And the Americans do in a very limited sense, but it's very odd. I don't know if people know about Canadian history very much, but there was this thing called Lower Canada, which is essentially Quebec, and this other thing called Upper Canada, which is essentially Ontario. And they existed simultaneously for quite a long time. The Lower Canada and Upper Canada did put provisions into their laws that recognized the duty-free right. But when they formed the Confederation, they didn't put that language in there, so the Canadians say, well, we didn't do it. It's not in our legislation, even though Upper Canada and Lower Canada had it in their legislation about the duty-free stuff. So it's a very, very big and very serious fight, and I can't remember exactly what year it was, but Chief Mitchell at Akwesasne went to the Canadian court, and they planned this all out. They were very, very deliberate and very specific. He took X number of Bibles. He had so many loaves of bread. He had some butter. He had a refrigerator, I think, a whole number of things that he brought across the border at Akwesasne at Cornwall and refused to pay any duty on it because they wanted to get the case tested in the courts. Because 1982, the Canadian government actually became a sovereign nation. They no longer were part of the British Commonwealth. They have their own constitution. And in the Constitution, it says that the Native people's treaty rights are hereby upheld and acknowledged, or something like that. And so this was a test. Do we have the treaty right that everybody claims we have to bring in these goods duty-free? Now that we have our own Constitution, it says our treaty rights are intact, and it went back to the Jay Treaty. It was part of their argument, and they had other arguments as well. And here's what the Supreme Court said, which is really bizarre. Yes, you, the people of Akwesasne and the Mohawk people, have the right to bring in all of their goods, et cetera, duty-free, but, because that's your treaty right, but we're a sovereign nation, and we don't recognize that right, because it would be an infringement on our sovereignty. So we don't recognize it. It's bizarre. Yes, you have the treaty right, because our Constitution says we've got to say that, but no, you don't. And so that is the Mohawk people of Akwesasne, have taken this to some United Nations. I think they went to the OAS first, the Organization of American States, and I think they were told to take a hike too. So I think they're negotiating this, or at least trying to get some kind of agreement out of the United Nations that this is a right that people have. And it's not only just Anishinaabeg people from the northern Great Lakes, it's everybody along the border, all the way up, in my way of thinking, all the way up to Alaska, and the Yukon people, who are divided by that border. And it doesn't make that much sense to have that border there for Native people. So every treaty, every law, everything recognizes that we are sovereign. We are recognized as sovereign. And part of the big problem is that the United Nations recognizes nations, and there's a whole list of things, but there's two things that are very, very important. One is territorial integrity, and the other is political independence. Those are the two major things that you need to show the United Nations that you are indeed a nation. So when the U.S. government came up to Sault Ste. Marie to negotiate these treaties, or wherever that happened to be, did they have territorial integrity? Of course not. They were up there to get our land from us. They didn't have any territorial integrity at all. Did they have political independence? Well, yeah, the international community recognized them as the right to enter into treaties, which is the right of nations. And so when people say, well, we gave you sovereignty, I say, no, we gave you sovereignty. We signed that treaty with you. We recognized your sovereignty, and we even helped you out on that land issue. So if anybody was giving anybody sovereignty, the Native people gave it to you. And you have to recognize that. These are two-way instruments. It's not a one-way deal. It's two ways. You get certain rights, we retain certain rights, et cetera, et cetera. This is an agreement just like that 1671 agreement in Sault Ste. Marie. We now agree to share this resource. We now agree to share this territory. We now agree in the context of 1836 and the 1842 treaty that we're standing on that land right now, we have the usual privileges of occupancy. We never gave that up. The courts, of course, are arguing over what are the usual privileges, but it's our right as Native people. It's never been diminished or extinguished. Those treaties are living treaties. And I guess well, we still have more time, but I'll end this little part. In 2008, the 4 nations in the Bowatang area signed a treaty that was explicitly designed to ignore that border. That's what it says. We don't recognize the border. We are one people. They signed 2 copies of it on Sioux Tribe Reservation. They got in their canoes, and they went to Sugar Island, and they canoed across from Sugar Island to Garden River without benefit of border guard. Well, they're all there taking videos and waving to people and whatever. And then they signed 2 copies at Garden River. It was called the Living Treaty Summit. Those treaties are still alive, and we recognize our common heritage as Native people in this area. It was a pretty big deal. We had over 500 people there from all over the place. And I was very happy to be part of it. The Center for the Study of Indigenous Border Issues was one of the sponsors of that conference, and we put together the academic stuff, program and the presentations and all that business. I should also mention the ZB Press there. This book here, it says, so you want to go to graduate school? Getting feedback. What you need to know about graduate school but may not have known you needed to ask. This was our first publication from the ZB Press, and it is distributed free to prospective students. Marty has a number of copies in the center, and we can get as many as we want. It's financed by the Dean of the Graduate School at Michigan State, and she wrote the foreword or the introduction or whatever that is in here. And you're not supposed to know this, and I'm probably not supposed to know this, but the reason that she has agreed to finance this publication, and I think we've printed up 5,000 copies and we've distributed them. She would love to say the things that are said in this book, but she'd be fired the next day. So Ken Poff and Bill Gordon put it all in writing. I mean, they didn't use her words, but she's very happy to be a part of this publication. So that was our first book, And there's another one coming out very soon, probably, I'm hoping within 1 week from now, on indigenous environmental issues, which will be available at Amazon and all the other places. You can get it as an ebook or print on demand or whatever. And this, whoop, it's not there anymore, but the map was part of that process as well. And we're trying to put some of these some of this process into the hands of Native people. You know, the academic stuff I was telling people earlier, the most boring thing in the world is to sit in a room with a bunch of academics yakking at each other. Oh my God, it's deadly. So we put on many conferences as the center, and every single time we put on a conference, we absolutely demand the community people are there. Not there as observers, are there presenting. And graduate students are always free. We try to pay for their travel, etc. Because we understand that the next generation of people have to be educated in our way of thinking, as opposed to this way of thinking. Yes, sir.
In North America, for you, what constitutes a legitimate border?
It depends on who you're defining as the border separating whom and whom. I agree that the border separates Canada from the United States. I got no problem with it at all.
Repeat the question.
Oh, the question was, what borders do I recognize as valid?
Or like how do you process it so that you do consider it valid? What are the standards?
Okay, well, I have an American passport. If I go across the border, wherever, I show my passport, because it's a lot easier than other things. But they say, why are you coming to Canada? And I say, I'm exercising my Jay Treaty rights. So what does that mean? That's why I have the right. I'm a Native person. I can cross the border for whatever purpose. They say, well, what's your purpose? That's why I'm going to drive over to Canada. I'm going to drive back to the United States. So I just want to exercise my rights. You know, they have no way of asking me what the hell I'm going to do over there. It's my right. It's my right to travel that border. And when I get hassled by these people, I say, I have the right to cross this border without being hassled by you. As soon as you say that word, if anybody ever wants to try this, you will see them put on this very, very calm demeanor, and they'll say, oh, sir, do you think I'm hassling you? I say, yes, you are, because it's against the law. They cannot hassle you. They can ask you all kinds of questions. You have the right to refuse to answer them, which I often do. But they can't hassle you. And so when they start asking me questions like that, I just tell them, you can't do that. One guy said, my license plate is M, these are the initials, M-I-N-D-N-I-M. Those are the letters. So they look at my license plate and say, Mindamin, what does that mean? I said, just read the letters. Am I Indian? I am. They say, you're an Indian? And I said, yeah, I'm a member of the White Earth Band of Minnesota Chippewa, or as I should say today, I'm a citizen of the White Earth Nation. And they say, what percentage are you? And I say, I am a member of the White Earth Band of Minnesota Chippewa. So I didn't ask you that question. I asked you what percent you are. I said, I am a member of the White Earth Band of Minnesota Chippewa. I said, you ask the Canadians what percent Canadian they are? And I usually start swearing at that point, calling them all sorts of things which they adamantly deserve. And after maybe 10 or 15 minutes of this little exchange, they might let me go. Yes.
What is your opinion on the visa that Mexican citizens are required to get into Canada?
What's that again?
Mexican citizens are required to get a special visa to get into Canada, and for each person that goes in, it's a $400 fine, and plus they have to pay whether it's possibly their kids name, their parents' name, their siblings' name, the whole deal, and sometimes it just gets denied. But American citizens aren't required to get this visa. So, since it's all in the
Yeah, I I don't know what the Canadian government's thinking. Why would they do that? I don't know. There are different rules for different groups. For example, we can travel across the U.S.-Canada border, but we probably would be very hard-pressed to travel to the Mexican border because our cultural connections aren't to Mexico. But the people down on the Mexico border, they can exercise that same right under the Homeland Security stuff. But for me to go down there and say, I'm going to cross into Mexico just because I'm an Indian, that ain't going to work. It ain't going to happen. And like the Mohawk people, they have their own passports. You may have heard recently they tried to go to Great Britain to play a lacrosse match. And the British government wouldn't recognize their passports. They sent them back home. Even though Hillary Clinton, who was the Secretary of State at the time, asked the British government, no, recognize them. You know, we recognize them across the U.S.-Canada border with their passports. You should maybe do the same thing. But the British said, no, we're not going to. So every country gets to set their own jurisdiction and their own rules. And if we, as sovereign people, want other governments to accept our sovereignty, then we have to accept theirs. So if they make rules that are crazy and stupid, as long as they don't affect us, there's nothing much we can say about it. And we shouldn't, because again, it's an issue of sovereignty. We don't want them interfering in our affairs, we want to interfere in theirs.
How about one more question, then we're going to call it a night.
Yes.
Because of the law schools and various universities even that do not teach history, they do not teach the treaties or the sovereignty issue, if they would, how would you see that the state governments might be better informed and equipped in making decisions affecting tribal peoples? If the educational systems could be changed, how would you advocate for that?
Well, many people up here, of course, know about fishing rights problems and wars we had up here. The state of Wisconsin did the right thing. They mandated that Native history be taught in the public school. That might be a good place to start. Michigan isn't going to do it, but that would be a place where it's all about education. And part of the problem that we face here in Michigan, and here's another shameless plug, I'm going to be running for the 37th State Senate District, which is just to the east of here. But I may be the first, if I get elected, I might be the first Indian. I'm definitely going to be the first radical environmentalist Indian, that's for sure. But if we don't have access to those levers of power, we can't do anything. So the way it is now, you get a new legislator down there every 4 years or 8 years or 12 years, depending on their term limits and stuff. Then you got to try to re-educate them, and it's just impossible. It's impossible. You don't have enough time. There's not enough hours in the day, and they're, number one, they don't want to hear it. So it's a very serious problem, really, really serious. The state essentially just ignores Native people, and and we actually heard this at Michigan State campus. Eat your fry bread and do your powwows and dress up in your costumes and just leave us alone. And this is the attitude. And that's essentially, it's a huge problem. And I don't know what the answer is. Education, of course, is very important. But I like to get them in court on various environmental stuff, which is where we're going. Because that's the only time they really pay attention to you. Because they have to. The courts force them to do so.
All right.
All right.
Join me in thanking,
Miigwech.
saying miigwech to Dr. Phil Bellfy for joining us this evening.
Miigwech to you.
Phil, we have a couple gifts for you. You have to dig in your goodie bag here.
All right.
And pull those out. Would like to get a photo with Center for Native American Studies staff, students. If you want to come down and join us down here, we'd like to get a photo real quick. And then we'll...
So the administration knows that their money was well spent. I'll put this over here.